Yeah, it's a good question because the Gospels are a form of ancient literature. Now, we've given them the title as Gospel, but that wasn't a formal type of writing per se. The word gospel comes from a Greek word, euangelion, which literally means good news. And originally, the idea was that there was one gospel message, one message of good news, but there were three accounts of that gospel. In other words, it was the gospel according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. And over time, it's just become conversationally understood that we call these letters gospels. Now, the type of literature they are, though, it is a tricky conversation to navigate because it isn't one thing specifically. Now, I personally would say that there are, or rather that the four gospels we have in our New Testament are a combination of historical narrative with strong theological underpinnings. In other words, like the church father Justin Martyr described them, they are the memoirs of the apostles. That's the way he articulated what the gospels were. When he quoted the gospels, he referred to them as the memoirs of the apostles. Now, just as an aside, it has been popular to say that the Gospels are a form of what's referred to as Greco-Roman biography, Greco-Roman bios, and bios literally being a formal form of literature in that day. Now, this idea was championed by an individual, a classicist named Richard Burridge. But I think personally that that's not entirely accurate and may actually negate the far more prevalent Hebrew narrative elements in the Gospels. Now, that's not to deny that the four Gospels we have are biographies of Jesus's life. They clearly are. But Greco-Roman bio, as a form of ancient literature, is actually separate and distinguished from the ancient literature of chronological history. So, in fact, if you look at examples of Greco-Roman bio, they include historical events, but tend to be more invented than investigative.
Right. Okay.
So when we refer to them as Greco-Roman bio, I think as myself as a historian, what I see is that it tends to run the risk of saying that they're mostly historical, right, but with some use of fictionizing literary devices. So we take the broad things as truth, but the details may be made up or altered by the authors for particular reasons. And I think that's at best incorrect, and at worst it can become dangerous in some instances. So I think the Gospels they're a very unique form of literature. But if you look and read them, you'll see the influences of the Gospel authors are fundamentally Hebrew scripture narrative that they're continuing on in the form of telling the continued story of the promises of God.
Cool. Thank you. And I think even maybe for the listener who's checking this out, maybe wouldn't consider themselves a Christians, what are the four Gospels? Can you just name them? And when were they written?
That's a great question. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the Gospels we refer to. And the date as to when they're written is hugely debated. In fact, if you have 10 scholars in the room who specialize in this area, you'll probably have 13 different opinions.
Of course.
So I tend more to err on the side of caution and say that rather than prescribing exact dates, because there's a debate, were these written before 70 AD or after AD? For the listener who's not aware of what 70 AD signifies and stands for, it's in 70 AD, Jerusalem was destroyed. And the Romans, they marched into Jerusalem, they sacked the city, and they destroyed the temple. And this is sort of a very clear and distinctive marker within the first century.
It'd be like it would be like a 9/11 type event. Like everybody would know about it.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. It would act as a marker within history that would define it. And so the question, are these written before or after that, is important because Jesus predicts the destruction of the temple. Mm-hmm. And so there are scholars who will say that obviously this is coming after that because Jesus couldn't have predicted that happening because he couldn't have known the future.
Right.
Right. And that's definitely not the only reason they ascribe dates. I tend to err more on the side of caution. Personally, I would say that the Gospels are very, very early. Personally, I would say that Mark was probably written first, followed by Matthew, Luke, and then John. But I think it's far safer to say that no matter what date you ascribe them, whether they're early, pre-70 AD, or later, post-70 AD, they clearly come from the first century in the time frame of the life of Jesus, in terms of the authors being either someone who knew Jesus personally or someone who knew Jesus. So no matter what you say, no matter what date you land on, because they don't come with dates, there are earliest source material for the life of the historical Jesus coming from the time period that he lived and being within the life of the eyewitnesses. That's what I would say definitively we can say. There are lots of theories. I have my own personal theories in terms of where the sort of window of dates they fall. But I think what we can say definitively is that unlike a lot of other gospel literature that pops up with ascribed names to other disciples, the ones we see from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the earliest ones that come from the time frame of when Jesus and the eyewitnesses were living.